For those of you who are not fully familiar with Howard Hughes, so we are an owner-operator who develops property in our master plan communities that range from Wall Street to Waikiki. So we really have a wide range of projects that span across the nation. So we'll go start here. So here are a couple of those projects. So try to put a few of those here on the screen to show how the wide range of projects that we work on, and really in a wide range of product types as well. So these include office buildings, inline retail, residential complexes, condos, doing a lot of those out in Hawaii, hotels, and even recently a baseball stadium out in our Las Vegas development. So our projects also include, as I mentioned, master plan communities. So we kind of focus on our different regions, and we're developing the commercial property within those master plan communities. So this also includes master planning sites from 20, 30 acre property to a couple 100 acre properties, and looking at the conceptual level, how we master plan and estimate those projects from a very early phase. So to be able to deliver these projects, we need to develop really accurate budgets from the beginning of the process. Really when the project is just an idea, there's no drawings, there's no really design that has been put together, really just we're working off of a program. And to do this, historical data is really critical to both build our cost database and to develop our historical database of previous projects that we can utilize. So by having both of these, it really allows us to develop those initial budgets for the projects that are accurate and can really be maintained through the life of the project, which is critical. So a little bit of the challenge. So the challenge with our business specifically is that we are not really trying to utilize data from, let's say, 3 4-story wood residential products to compare and understand the cost on our next 4-story residential product, but really how can we harness the data from, say, a hotel building that we're building in Houston to an office building that we're working in Columbia. So I wanted to expand on this concept a little bit about how we create consistency and how we break down really the project data that allows us to increase efficiency utilizing our historical information. So here's a little bit of an outline of what we'll be going into more detail on today. I wanted to really focus on how myself and our team at Howard Hughes approaches these different items that will hopefully kind of give everybody here some insight to our process and allow you to hopefully take away some of that information to assist you in how you do your work. So I wanted to really start with talking about how much detail is too much detail. What's the right amount of detail for a conceptual stage and a historical database to be able to utilize that? Then wanted to get into a little bit about project data. So this is another kind of key aspect in being able to pull together all this information. Then I wanted to touch on exploring potential technology and kind of wrap up with how to standardize this process to ensure that you have the sanity checks and consistency for developing this information. So I wanted to start here talking about detail, and really how much detail is too much detail. So I'd imagine, like most people here, I'd imagine most people have had a role in estimating at some point here, that the more detail, the better. I often use a phrase like, give me everything you have. I want all the information possible. Now, in most instances, this is great, and getting all the detail really allows you to get in and understand it, and get into the weeds scoping the information. But early on in the conceptual phase, too much data can sometimes result in some inefficiencies. So this is true both in cost databases for conceptual estimating, as well as in historical databases. So I've tried to visually show this concept here of kind of when you have very little data, you're constantly looking to trying to fill in the gaps to be able to utilize the information you have. So often with little information, you don't have the kind of full confidence, and you end up spending a lot of time looking into trying to validate the information you have, how that applies. So this is kind of an inefficient way to do things. But as you get more and more information, your confidence begins to grow. You start filling in the gaps, and your ability to utilize that information in an efficient manner increases. Now, I say that kind of to a point for the conceptual side of things. So at a certain level, you start having so much information, so much detail, that it takes time to sort through that information and really understand how you can utilize that information for how you're going to apply it to it. So at some stage, you have so much that you're just digging through and you're spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to combine it or how to apply it to what you're working on, where it becomes somewhat of an inefficient process. So with most projects that I have worked on, the project really, when you get into that level of detail, that fine detail, you don't have a lot of similarities. The projects are different, the aspects of it are different down at that level. Therefore, during conceptual estimating, it's definitely more beneficial to understand some like complete all-in systems and knowing where then there are potential cost variations within those kind of all-in complete systems. One case of this is the MEP trades. So you can start to understand all-in cost of different types of systems, knowing that there will be minor variations project to project. But then once you have your historical information, you can also understand what the kind of magnitude of that range of variation is, so you can start to anticipate that with the next project you're working on. Now, this is not always the case, and really you're trying to find a balance of where that level of detail is, and that's mainly because the variations differ from project to project. So this really becomes challenging. I'll use an example of a trade finish, the finishes division. So if you look at the finish division, there's kind of multiple significant categories within your trade, within that division, such as flooring and walls. So if I try to group all this together at a conceptual level, it's very difficult to understand how kind of those two factors adjust your cost. And if you're working on a new project with where your flooring changes to, say, engineering hardwood instead of an LVT flooring, it's difficult if all that's combined together to be able to understand how to adjust your data. So there is a balance between divisions where you can group that together and understand the variation, and other divisions where it makes more sense to break that down more. So this starts to show just a very generic terms of the overarching breakdown that I see. So at the top, you kind of have your total number. You have your total cost. It's a very high-level breakdown. This is sometimes used by other groups in our office to look at that total cost to plug it into their workflow. From us, this is really too high of a structure. So below this, you get into your division, and typically I'd say your CSI division, so your kind of master division subsets. And then below this is where a little bit of talked about, you have your subdivision structure. So you start breaking that down. And then below that, you start getting into kind of all your detail and really the vast level of detail that you can have on the estimates. So I mentioned the 09, but another example may be kind of your 08 division, your openings division. So by breaking this down into doors and frames and to glass and glazing, you can quickly understand how items like your overall glazing cost for a project based on the percentage of facade, and really understand how that impacts it, although you might have multiple different types of windows within that. You can also understand door costs. So if you know your total door costs, you can look at that on a project basis and understand kind of a general idea of where your door cost should fall, and then be able to adjust that based on if your project has any variations to it. So this slide starts to show kind of a little bit of what we're currently working with for our historical data. So as you can see, there's different divisions, the 03 division, the 07 division, 08 division, where we start to break these things down. And we break it down to really help further develop our estimates by allowing those to be broken down to where we can adjust for them. So what we kind of focused on here is grouping of elements that can be easily quantified and then adjusted to utilize putting together or comparing against new project budgets. Now, the detail is always good to have, and we certainly store those breakdowns as backup reference, but as I discussed earlier of the glazing example, if you start breaking down your glazing into curtain wall, windows, operable walls, that all might exist on a project at a conceptual phase, but you don't really know where your new project's going to fall. This requires an additional level of effort when you start putting together that estimate to at least set guidelines of what that breakdown might be to be able to accurately compare against it. And while assumptions are certainly required at a conceptual estimating level, making too many assumptions begins to really impact the design potential for the project. Now, heard earlier that there was one architect yesterday, but if there are any in the room, this is kind of my outreach to any architects that we might have here. But when we're really developing conceptual estimates, we found it's best to keep it at a higher level of breakdown to really not lock in those design parameters too early on in a project and really allow architects to express their creativity through the design. This creativity does have boundaries, and we typically provide those and set those for an architect to stay within. But we've found that by not over-defining, it allows for that uniqueness, that architectural expression, and overall really a better project at the end of the day. So by defining a conceptual budget that, let's say, has assumptions on facade cost, but did not define the percentage of glazing types or other facade elements, the architect is able to deliver an extremely creative project. So like the picture kind of at the bottom right of the screen here. So in this project was an office building that we have up in our Maryland property. And we were able to set an early conceptual budget for the facade cost, but allow the architect to really express the design by not setting too many parameters. So they were able to include items like architectural fins, decorative precast, some curtain wall and some window wall, but create that mix that fits within our budget, but allows them to really express their design. So one of the keys here is the president at Howard Hughes, our president, uses the phrase "stay in your lane," and I think this truly fits in this type of thing, where we're setting up the proper boundaries to make sure the project proceeds on track and in the right track, but we're really not trying to get into the design aspect. We have our architects for that, we should utilize them for that, and we should benefit for that. So now I've focused a little on the level of detail here and how it benefits really efficiency and the project overall. But one key aspect is that the level of detail will likely vary from team to team. What might work for us at Howard Hughes might differ. And really what's critical about it is thinking of the historical data and your cost data base in a similar manner for the conceptual side of things, and making sure you're aligning that data to a similar level of detail. So by doing this, the data that you're compiling in your historical database can help you better understand those divisional costs in your cost database and continually update that and stay on track of the cost data that you're utilizing to pull together estimates by easily being able to compare that against your historical data. So now just wanted to switch over and talk about something that I feel is just as important as the cost data, and that's really the project information for us. As I noted before, we work on very few, if any, really repetitive projects. So the challenge is taking cost from one project and applying that to another to help influence or verify the cost that we're at when there's multiple differences that exist between the two projects. So to do this, we track a host of information pertaining to the project. So some of these are your typical variables, your gross square footage, your leasable square footage, skin square footage, number of keys, units, so on. But in addition to these, we also denote other pertinent information that may be kind of specific to that project type or unique to that project that may have cost implications that would cause it to be different from other projects. So, for example, on a residential product, noting how many podium versus wood levels. This is a 5/2 project. Is this a 4-level stick project? Understanding that on a residential product greatly influences where your costs fall. So knowing that can help adjust the data. Also, on-grade versus podium amenity decks. Major cost driver, good to know. And then also parking and any retail if this is a mixed use property. So by tracking all this information, we can then utilize it to assist in the development of conceptual estimates for new projects. And this data really helps us understand the ranges for cost variations within the project scope that I talked about a little bit earlier. And we do this internally a couple different ways. So when we're developing conceptual estimates, we first utilize our cost database, which includes all of the cost data for our project types that have been pulled together from our historical data. So in there we have residential wood product types, we have concrete office product types, we have standalone retail, we have podium retail, we have so on and so forth, many different project types to try to encompass the wide range of projects that we work on. So then the cost data for each of these product types is then pulled together into, compiled into really a conceptual estimate for what I'll say is a typical Howard Hughes product type. So as I mentioned earlier, we don't really have any typical, but we've kind of set a baseline for what a typical concrete office building would be. And we kind of pulled together that cost data into a baseline for that. And that really gives us something to work off of. So once we have that established based on the size and the scale of the project that we're looking into and pulling together a cost estimate for, we can then modify it based on the assumptions that we're working off of for that specific location. So whether that's a really tight site, or whether we're looking at adding a lot of retail component into it, or whether there's a unique parking situation, we can then adjust that baseline from there. And having this project data allows us to do that. So the project data, as I mentioned, has the range of modifications to that baseline because those are the projects that we've worked on. So we can understand how these different divisions range based on modifications that we've seen in the past and utilize that to influence how we're putting together estimates for the future. So the other aspect that this data assists us with is really confirming estimates that we have both in the concept level and then really throughout the whole life of the project all the way through GMP. So we're constantly looking to how is the budget for that project comparing against our historical data that we have, other projects that we've worked on. And as I discussed a little bit, the challenge with the comparison is making sure that we're accurately comparing apples to apples as much as possible so that we're looking at these on a consistent basis. And by doing this, this allows us to present that information to who we might be reviewing it with in a truer comparison fashion rather than trying to put forth the raw data and then explain why there are differences in the cost data. So these comparisons typically adjust for the major project items that we've identified in this project data that have pertained to each project. And then we can put together cost estimates for that modification to then bring them in line. So if you have so you're effectively comparing similar projects utilizing your historical data. So this slide starts to show an example of this, and this one's elaborated a little bit because we've put some pictures here to go along with the detail. But this is for a residential product looking at it, and we're looking at the differences in 3 historical projects compared against one project that we're looking to move forward with. Now, we've looked at a couple different things here. So one being, I mentioned this a little before, the courtyard. The new project we're comparing it to had an elevated courtyard where the projects we're comparing against were all on grade. So therefore, there's a major cost differential there, and if we just showed the raw data, it'd show a substantial bump in our new project, but if we don't account and adjust our historical projects to kind of fall in line with that. Some other aspects we looked at here is efficiency. So this helps on 2 fronts. It helps verify that our efficiency for our new project is kind of in line with this and we're not way out on our design for some reason, as well as adjusting for that efficiency, because efficiency can really drive costs, especially when you look at this on a leasable square footage basis. A couple other major factors we had in this comparison: retail, the amount of retail we're looking at, and the garage layout. So both of these, although we break out those aspects of the project so the cost doesn't implement it, how they're oriented in the project does have cost implications depending on how you break things down. So the amount of retail, how that lays out in the building does have cost implications, and we typically look at that to make a modification, an estimate to how that would change the building in a different fashion. Same thing with garage. If you have podium garage or a precast wrap garage, those can both have implications to how the cost is pulled together for the different comparison. So this type of workflow in pulling together this data, making the cost adjustments for it, has really proved to be extremely beneficial when we're working on a variety of projects that we do. The reason being is that we work with many other groups within our company. One of those being our developers primarily, who are looking at the new opportunities on our sites. And we often get questions similar to, I just built a project in I just built a residential project in the Woodlands, which is one of our properties north of Houston, for X. And now I'm looking at a project in Columbia. Why is the cost so much higher? So this type of analysis allows us to pull those two together and adjust for our escalation, adjust for our regional city index to bring it up, but also adjust for this project data, because the property in Houston might be a 4-story stick project and they're wanting to compare it to a 5/2 project in Columbia. Now we know those aren't going to compare, but if we make the necessary adjustments, then we can look at the actual data and how those start to align on more of an apples to apples comparison. Now we've also used this to really understand cost across all the regions that we work. So by setting up kind of a baseline, we can look at all of our, say, office products and make adjustments to get them kind of all aligned on a project data basis, and look at them on an equal comparison of how the costs have come in. This information has been helpful in exploring kind of the next areas where we want to look at, the cost associated with those, and where it makes most sense to develop across the country. So overall, really, project data is extremely beneficial, and as I led with, just as really important as the cost in being able to understand where the variations in project costs come from, and really adding that extra layer of detail. Now, all this sounds great, but you have to have a platform to be able to store this information. And that really leads me into kind of the next item wanting to go through here. So as an owner, finding a technology platform that provides this breakdown has been a little challenging. Most software is developed to handle a lot of detail and not necessarily geared towards the conceptual estimating side. So we've explored various avenues for this and been able to house this information in a few different platforms, and really found multiple options for kind of just housing the information, but the cost information. But the challenge comes into play with really the project data and this adjustment factor, because it's going to be different every time. So how do we store, or how can we store all that information together to be able to utilize it in efficient manner? And really, the challenge has been with flexibility, because flexibility is key, and flexibility is challenging with software. So internally, we've been able to find some platforms to house all the cost data, and we've been in discussions about how we can start to create a platform, really a customized platform that pulls in that project data and allows it to work together. Now, we've paused a little bit on this because our company is actually undergoing even greater effort, and it possibly will further this goal of consolidating the information to increase the efficiency. So this process is ongoing, but within our firm, it's really consolidating technology across all of the platforms that we utilize across all of the different divisions within our company. So leasing, tenant coordination, development, every aspect of what we do. And really creating a fully integrated system that shares information platform to platform. So by doing this, then the data just needs to be inputted once, and once it's inputted, then it can just be shared. So what we've done is kind of take a step back from what we're doing and looking how our data which is utilized by a lot of other aspects within our company, can then be shared. So we're not duplicating effort. So we've taken a step back and we're looking at this as a company-wide basis to be able to have information like square footages, leasable area that are inputted whether by us or another, but we can share that information and really utilize it as a company as a whole. And then we can then layer on the additional information that we use to try to make this the best platform as possible. So unfortunately, we're in the middle of that process, and we anticipate having the first phase of that done by the end of the year. So next year we may have a better sense of exactly where we stand with that and where we're at on our technology platform. So the last thing I wanted to go in here is talking a little bit about sanity checks, and really kind of talking about how standardization of the process is key, and how it really allows you to run those sanity checks on the information that you're developing. So there's a few different ways to break down things and track information. And this breakdown will likely differ from company to company, but overall, what really matters is creating a standardized process that works for your company. And I really view this standardization in three parts. So consistency, accuracy, and diligence. So the consistency aspect is really developing the efficiency as well as the confidence in the estimates that are produced. So by developing a structure that works for you and really sticking to it, you create a platform that can be efficiently utilized for everyone in your group. So we have also found that it's important when working with people outside our group. So being consistent when we share information, whether that's internal people that are just in another group of our company or external people, that consistency certainly helps the process. And it limits the questioning of the different aspects you're pulling together, really not questioning the underlying data, but then having conversations about the data, which is key. The second item is accuracy, and I think everybody here understands that accuracy is critically important. One way we work to increase accuracy is by developing breakdowns that we then mandate in our GMPs and our estimates that are coming in from external sources. This breakdown then aligns with our historical data and it aligns with our cost database. And by doing this, we're getting that breakdown directly from the source, and we're being consistent in how we are getting information in for the projects. And by starting with the right information, we can then finish with the right information. So we found this is very beneficial in increasing the accuracy of the information we're working with. And the last item I want to talk a little bit about is just diligence. And diligence is really the key to all of this. It's really staying on top of the ever-changing information and how critical that really is. Whether it's market conditions or tariffs that I've heard a little bit of discussion about here, costs are really ever-changing, and we need to ensure that we are tracking this and accounting for it in our conceptual estimates so that we can accurately develop an estimate that we can track through the life of a project, and we're not having late additions because we haven't accounted for something that's happening within the market. So the way we have done this is really being very diligent about storing information, about updating cost information. And really this just takes time and effort that has to be allocated to do this. But at the end of the day, it allows your team to stay current with the information and be as accurate and consistent. So we handle this a little bit by really dating the information. So we're assigning the dates of when we pull in the information and when we update our cost database. That allows us to start to see when the last time we had updated the information. So as we're working to compile a new estimate, we understand how old that information is, whether we need to relook at it and verify those costs. We also assign kind of reminder dates that on a yearly basis, we're looking at going back through all of our project types to verify the information and make sure we're staying on track and being accurate with that data. So working with all these aspects to really standardize the information at the end builds confidence. And that confidence allows you to know that the information is correct, and you're reviewing your sanity checks on the information. You're not questioning the underlying data. You're really then questioning what the data is saying. So with that, I hope this kind of going through this information about how we have utilized cost data has helped you and give you a little bit of insight, and hopefully you can have some takeaways from that to be able to adjust how you do your work with conceptual estimating in your historical databases. With that, I will wrap it up and open it up to any questions that anybody may have.